Shalom. I want to give all praises and honor and glory to the only true God of heaven and earth, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Israel, whose true name is Yahweh, and to his only begotten Son, the Messiah, the Lamb of God, that taketh away the sins of Israel by the shedding of his own blood, whose true name is Yahweh Shai. And double honors to my elders and teachers in Green Millstone, and honors to all the prophets and teachers that carry the spirit of faith and truth within them. My name is Zechariah. Hear my speech concerning the truth that is the word of the living God, which word pertains to you Israelites, which are you so-called Negroes, Hispanics, Latinos, and Native Indians, even you Israelites who may look like the heathen, who may have the appearance of the heathen, but are really descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We are coming into a time where the Lord will fulfill his word. The collection of sayings, divine sayings, pronouncing doom and salvation. And in the midst of these times, there is an election, a chosen remnant who are Israelites of the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who by faith and by faithfulness will survive and will not fall to ruin by the evils which the Lord will bring upon earth. Tragedies which the Lord will bring upon earth. That is societal collapse, and failures of systems, famine, armed conflict, geopolitically and socially, and chaos, mass depopulation, high mortality upon earth, pestilence, plagues sent by God, crisis, polycrisis. And you have a remnant known as the election who are Israelites, who by faith and by faithfulness will survive these things, leading all the way up to the second coming of the Lord Yahweh Shai, who by divine power and authority shall deliver and save the elect. Now, the focus of this lesson is concerning the maintenance of trust, and faith in these difficult times and in the difficult times that are coming. Which when it comes to the rulers of this world, the elites, those who have power and authority, and whose heart is ultimately set on evil and greed ultimately. And they have an agenda concerning people's livelihoods, concerning people's souls. Plans to collapse the economy, this current financial system, to orchestrate chaos, grid failures, and ultimately a collapse. Which these things will come inevitably, whether intentionally on their part or indirectly on their part. These things will ultimately come. See, Esau, Edom, which is the so-called white man, a nation of people whom the Lord hates, and plays a very important role in the grand scheme of the Lord's purposes. See, they're in the midst, in the middle in the center of a lot of the evil and violence that shall be fulfilled in these last days. Being that red horse, and ultimately the proud, and they have desires to establish a digital system involving digital ID, digital currency, programmable money, and implantable technology, which is the mark that John the Revelator have written about. And this is going to affect everyone, the world. And faith and integrity and trust in Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahweh Shai will be directly, opposed due to or by way of livelihood and freedom being threatened. Your whole stability or your whole place in its current system in society being pulled from below you. A whole one, a big rug pull that the elites will ultimately do. But these spiritual things, or shall I say virtues, that we ultimately are taught in this wisdom, in this truth, according to the goodness and influence of Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahweh Shai. With these virtues, we have a defense, a resilience, against these, evils, against these temptations. And that's how we're going to ultimately stand before, ultimately, God, who will come by way of Yahweh Shai, who is the fullness or the likeness of God, shall I say, along with the heavenly host. And we're going to receive a favorable end. And when I say we, when I, personalize it, I'm speaking, from the perspective of hope, but this is ultimately the case of the elect, whoever they may be. And ultimately they will have a favorable end via faith in Yahweh Shai, faith in Yahweh, according to the glory of Yahweh. And I was meditating on Matthew chapter 6, verse 19, in the Living Bible translation. This is Matthew chapter 6, verse 19. Don't store up treasure here on earth, where they can erode away or may be stolen. And we are coming into a time, a point of history, a point in the current, the course of this, of human existence, of mankind existence, where anything of value, of earthly value, will ultimately be threatened and come to failure or taken from you. Again, economic, failure, financial disruption, and ultimately change. Food disruption, famine, the failure of markets. Even now, job markets, are at a low rate. A moment in society where traffic This whole system, this whole, machine of a society will ultimately fail. So people's resources, people's investments, people's source of trust will fail ultimately. Their values, their treasures, their wealth, their livelihood, and their earthly sense of stability will fail. And ultimately, this is why we're advised by the Lord Yahweh Shai to not, ultimately store up treasure on this earth, to not invest, and put much, concern on these things, on a general level. But I'm tying this scripture, through, this point of history that we're in ultimately. Verse 20, it says, store them in heaven where they will never lose their value and are safe from thieves. Yeah. Salvation, righteousness and faith, this truth, your good works, these spiritual things that will profit you forevermore ultimately. And this is where, trust is, founded. Hope is founded in a place that is of stability, absolute. You think about, the things of God. That's according to his power, and his mercy. That's according to his truth. It is absolute. Meaning what? It cannot be diminished or changed. Yeah, you think about your faith, that's of divine power. You think about this hope, this righteousness, what you have in Yahweh Shai. In your labors that you work through Yahweh Shai, via, with Yahweh Shai, according to this truth. These are heavenly things ultimately, or by heavenly inspirations. And these things cannot be taken away or filled. So when Esau do what he do, or when circumstance, ultimately inevitably come, these prophetic circumstances, which a great failure, a time where the Lord will bring a darkness upon the society, that's coming too. That's been prophesied by the prophets, the elders, the teachers, the men of the Lord. Famines, prophesied by prophets of old, prophesying the scriptures. And ultimately an economic and financial disruption, failure, and change. You know? But this trust and this faith and this counsel becomes, that defense, against those threats. And ultimately, when your trust and your hope is in these things, and these earthly things, and these earthly things fail, and are destroyed or taken away, then your hope and your trust are taken away also, fail also. So then comes despair and weakness. And then what can happen ultimately, Esau can, motivate you in a wrong way. That is what taking his implantable technology, which is the mark, which is going to be a physical instrument, that's going to involve programmable money, and digital currency ultimately. With that mark where you will be able to buy and sell in that particular time. And this is a real thing. This is truly coming. This is a real agenda of the elites. And the things that we're seeing now is all leading to that direction ultimately. So Esau will have the upper hand, against you who are morally, and spiritually, vulnerable ultimately, because of your trust and your treasure in your heart being in these worldly things. The scriptures tell you in KJV, in the book of Matthew chapter 6, wherever your heart is, there will your treasure be. Or wherever your treasure is, there will your heart be, Salaki. So your heart being in this world, being in these systems and these values, these worldly values, these treasures, these worldly investments, money, these jobs, and the profit bodies, jobs, these possessions, etc. Your heart will be vulnerable, because these things will be made vulnerable. And the scriptures tell you, concerning he that have no rule, over his spirit, is like a city without walls. In other words, without defense and protection. And ultimately by this counsel, there's a level of discretion, and fortitude that comes by this wisdom, this truth, by the knowledge of God's power, by the knowledge of his mercy. You have, an understanding, faith and knowledge that goes beyond that weak, rational thought of concern and fear of what you would do or how you would eat, how you will live. And that's weakness. That's a weak, state of mind, ultimately. you know. And ultimately, in fact, let's go to the book of 2nd Esdras, chapter 16, verse 41. He that selleth, let him be as he that fleeth away, and he that buyeth as one that will lose. He that occupieth merchandise as he that have no profit by it, and he that buildeth as he that shall not dwell therein. He that soweth as if he should not reap. So he that planteth the vineyard as he that shall not gather the grapes. They that marry as they that shall get no children, and they that marry not as the widowers. And therefore they that labor, labor in vain. And ultimately this is, signifying a time where conditions of society will ultimately drastically change to a time of insecurity, vulnerability, and ultimately danger. Of jeopardy. People's lives, very lives, and livelihood will be jeopardized. People's hopes for wealth, for families, for marriage will be, threatened and ultimately taken away. The time of buying, will ultimately, there's going to be a time where you won't be able to buy. It's either, you're going to be dead, or, you're going to be just trying to survive, or there ain't going to be nothing to buy. Basically, circumstances, according to the Lord's, word, according to the Lord's purposes, will ultimately, change. People's lives are going to be turned upside down, basically. Evil and crisis upon earth, ultimately. To put it simply, and this basically sums up what's coming. Danger, death, destruction, evils, and woes. So putting your trust, in these spiritual and heavenly things, and rearranging, ultimately your values in a place that is strong and enduring. That's going to make you resilient and of fortitude. In fact, Wisdom of Solomon chapter 8, it tell you, wisdom teach fortitude, which means moral strength, moral courage, mental strength, mental courage. You have a strong mind, and that's basically a spirit that the Lord cultivate within you, in this faith, in this truth. So when these evils do come, you'll remain in the spirit of a Mashiach, in the spirit of truth, in the spirit of faith, whereby, you shall live. Because you will be righteous, via that faith, by way of that faith, you will be righteous, by way of that spirit, the spirit of Yahweh Shai being in you. in unbelief and doubt, and ultimately being, susceptible to temptation, to fall into temptation. That is, in this case, taking the mark, receiving his implantable technology, which is the mark, worshiping the image of the beast, and ultimately, getting involved with that system ultimately. Idolatry as well. You think about loving money as well. In this case, it's going to be a new form of money. And ultimately, the scripture says whatever is not of faith is sin. Because of your unbelief, you will be rejected ultimately. And the spirit of Yahweh Shai, does not associate with that disposition. With mind and spirit. Hebrews chapter 13 verse 6. So we say with confidence, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? And this is the mentality that we are to be equipped with. If you be of the elect, that is, when you come into, those days, the days that are near and close, more than we possibly think. Confidence in Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahweh Shai, that is the opposite or against the fear of men and their power. And we have enemies, that is rulers in high places who will ultimately practice evil by way of their power over economies and societies and governments, over politicians, and government officials. They have, an agenda, a determination that is against our very souls. That is against the souls of the poor, the needy, and anything that is weak. And that's always been the mindset of the wicked, of Edom, the so-called white man, who is the devil that is mentioned throughout the Bible. False flags, operations, orchestrated chaos on mass scale, and ultimately just evils that come by his hand, whether intentionally or indirectly, ultimately, no doubt. You think about World War, which is a thing coming. That will no doubt come by this man's influence, decisions. And even if he don't directly, want, that it still will come because of this man's pride. It is written in the book of Isaiah chapter 33, that verse 11, you shall conceive chaff, you shall bring forth stubble, your breath as fire shall devour you. And this fits Esau's, course of life. The course of his authority, where he's going to put himself in a place of danger. He's going to bring ruin and destruction upon himself and upon those who are with him, ultimately, who holds onto his side. That is the American people. You unbelievers who hold onto the side of the devil, of wickedness, of lies, of this world, ultimately. He's preparing, the ingredients for fire, wood, chaff, and he's, will ultimately bring about a fire. It says, you shall conceive chaff, you shall bring forth stubble, your breath as fire shall devour you. He's going to bring about destruction that's going to consume himself and those that be with him. The world itself will be brought into a state of chaos, ultimately. And ultimately that fire, and that destruction will be nuclear warheads, nuclear destruction, to be specific, which is going to be the final nail in the coffin of this great kingdom, America. Nuclear destruction, the great, evil fortune and end of this place, as well as Israel as well, the land that is. It says, and the people shall be as the burning limes of lime, and thorns cut up shall they be burnt in the fire. All the wicked, and all that do proudly, will have their part in the second death, ultimately. That is the lake of fire, which is nuclear destruction, nuclear radiation, and nuclear fire, and radiation, So you're going to have evils upon evils, and an even greater evil, upon a society that is nuclear destruction. The final nail in the coffin. But Acts chapter 4 verse 12, there is salvation in no one else. Under all heaven, there is no other name for men to call upon to save them. And this is ultimately, regarding the name Yahweh Shai. Through Yahweh Shai's name, through his authority and power, through faith in him, shall you be saved, ultimately. In his true name, the name you call him by, is Yahweh Shai, ultimately. And through Yahweh Shai, there's salvation. In fact, let's go to the book of John. St. John chapter, bear with me. St. John chapter 8, verse 12. Later in one of his talks, this is the Living Bible translation, which is a translation where, I read from time to time. You gotta be careful in this translation. I haven't read it all, I just read some scriptures, just recently. St. John chapter 8, verse 12. Later in one of his talks, Yahushua said to the people, I am the light of the world. So if you follow me, you won't be stumbling through darkness, for living light will flood your path. So walking according to Yahushua, that is to his doctrine and counsel, to the guidance that come by him. You will ultimately be in a way of living, a life. Ultimately salvation, immortality. But on this side, you'll also prolong your life. Now, some of you believers, I have to balance it out, will have the fortune of dying. The Lord take you out of this world by some way, or by persecution. But nevertheless, if you, die in Yahushua, live in Yahushua, all shall receive everlasting life. In salvation ultimately. Those who die in the faith will also be resurrected by the power of Yahushua when he comes. So if you follow Yahushua, that is to follow his word, his doctrine. That is the doctrine of God ultimately. You will not stumble. In other words, you won't die. You won't die by famine. You won't go out by way of these evils that shall come. The Lord's about to bring a darkness on earth, man. A horror, cruelties upon earth. A dark period, man. That's ultimately going to come by, you people's wickedness, pride, and ignorance, ultimately. That's also, what darkness also symbolizes as well. It can symbolize wickedness, unbelief, and ignorance as well, which will ultimately lead to evil. Evil follows after evil. Evil tends to evil ultimately. So you won't die, in your wickedness, and your unbelief, and your ignorance, and your unfaithfulness ultimately, because you reject, or you receive Yahushua's word ultimately. So to be, more specific, the darkness in this case, is more concerning, evil, ultimate evil, the moral, spiritual evil. Also, you will die by that evil. That's the stumbling. Your unbelief, ignorance of the truth, and unfaithfulness. And the spirit of Yahweh Shai is against that. I think it's good right here. I'm gonna close off on that. I'm gonna give all praises and honor and glory to Yahweh Bahashem, Yahweh Shai. Shalom.